This is the first episode of a podcast called Connections. And the spirit of these conversations is to really start with a book or a project or an individual, and then kind of work out from there to larger and larger audiences. Really, the School of Humanities, the university community, the Houston community, the national kind of conversation around whatever the book or the project's about. So your recent book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, is insanely appropriate for that project because it's exactly what you do, right? You go back to the 19th century and you work your way really across much of America, but also you land in Texas at some point. And so it's really kind of a perfect book and a perfect story to begin our podcast with. So let me shut up and let's hear from you what the book is about, and then we can kind of have a conversation.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. The book tells the story of a woman named Henrietta Wood, and in 1853, about 8 years before the Civil War began, she was living as a free woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, when she was kidnapped and lured across the Ohio River into the slave state of Kentucky. And there was a guy there named Zebulon Ward, who was actually a deputy sheriff in Kentucky at the time, who orchestrated her abduction and her enslavement. And so subsequently she was sold by Ward to some slave traders who took her to Mississippi. She ended up there on a cotton plantation. She was taken to Texas during the Civil War. But ultimately, and really the reason that I was drawn to her story is the way that it ended, because after the Civil War, she was freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. She returned to Cincinnati in 1869 and managed the next year to sue Zebulon Ward in court and win a judgment against him after a long process of litigation. So in 1878, she was awarded $2,500 in restitution for her long ordeal. And I think that's the largest sum that I know of that any U.S. court ever awarded to a formerly enslaved person as restitution.
Do we know what that would be today in dollars?
Probably close to $60,000 or $65,000. So it was a significant sum. It actually wasn't as much as she had sued for. She petitioned the court for $20,000, both in damages from the abduction and everything she had suffered, but also in lost wages that she could have been earning between 1853 and 1869. And so she sued for $20,000, and she was awarded a fraction of that, $2,500, but it was a substantial amount, and it did make a big difference for her and her family in subsequent years.
So tell us what happens then. I mean, they eventually land in Chicago.
That's right. So after the victory, Wood moves to Chicago with her son, who had actually been born in Mississippi during her enslavement there. And they settle on the south side of Chicago. And in the 1880s, her son was actually able to purchase a house in Hyde Park for about $1,200 outright. And we know that that would have been very difficult for any wage-earning family to do at the time, much less an African-American household, without some kind of other resources or loans from friends or family. And so it's extremely likely that Henrietta Wood's award, this sum of money that she had won a few years before, enabled her son to buy this house. And of course, real estate, owning a house, having property and wealth of that kind that could then be, passed on or used to secure credit, was very powerful for that family. And in fact, he was able to use it to fund his legal education, and he became a lawyer in Chicago.
You point out he took out multiple mortgages on that property, and essentially funded a very successful legal career.
Absolutely, it made a big difference. Rising property values at the time and end of the 19th century in Chicago. So it's really kind of a story of what might have been for African Americans like Wood and her son in that period, had they had some capital, like the kind that she received. Because, of course, and I talk a little bit about in the book the way that the nation's retreat from the promises of emancipation and Reconstruction left most formerly enslaved people without that kind of capital. And so the history that follows really through the 20th century is one of a growing racial wealth gap, racial disparities of all kinds, not just in the South, but in places like Chicago too, with housing discrimination and redlining. Many of the things that contemporary advocates of reparations point to in the 20th century start in Chicago. And Sims, that was Wood's son name. I can't remember if I mentioned that, but Sims's ability to start with a house there is sort of the what might have been story, right, that runs parallel to the story of what actually did happen to the south side of Chicago and to most people who lived there.
As you know, Earl Lewis has been here for,
mm-hmm.
for 3 days, and
mm-hmm.
Earl just gave a series of the Campbell lectures and talked a lot about race and American history.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
I just to kind of set this in a broader context, if we date 1619 as the entrance of the first
mm-hmm.
African slaves sold in the U.S. to
mm-hmm.
today, we're looking at a 400-year
mm-hmm.
history, almost 2/3 of which is built literally on the backs of
mm-hmm.
enslaved,
mm-hmm.
human beings. So there's like a bigger
mm-hmm.
bigger story here that
mm-hmm.
you address in the book as well. I mean, I
mm-hmm.
I don't think the typical American citizen is aware.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're vaguely aware of this history
mm-hmm.
and the background,
mm-hmm.
but they're not aware of the economic
mm.
results of slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, I can honestly say I was not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but once you lay out the case, it's like,
right.
whoa, you've got...
Well, I think, Dr. Lewis mentioned the 1619 Project and, similar projects that are now raising more awareness and bringing this history to life. And I think what it is hopefully making people more aware of is the role that slavery played in the economic development of the nation. On the eve of the Civil War, one statistic that's actually pretty familiar to historians of the time, but is starting to gain wider purchase, is that if you added up the value, sort of the market value of all of the slaves in the United States on the eve of the Civil War, it was worth more than all the factories, banks, and railroads in the country combined. So this was a huge source of investment for not just the labor, but actually the value in the bodies of enslaved people who could be sold, as Wood experienced and was. And so, the man who enslaved her in Mississippi owned 700 to 800 people on the eve of the Civil War, which was worth maybe $1 million just in 1860 dollars in the value of his slaves alone. So this was a huge capital investment, and men like him actually, poured more money into buying more people precisely because of their value in the antebellum period.
The story also is disturbingly contemporary, right? I mean, there's a lot of geography in the book. I mean, you really begin on the river separating Ohio and Kentucky. Mm-hmm. That's where this abduction takes place, essentially. Mm-hmm. And there really is a north-south mm-hmm. kind of division here, although it's not absolute. Mm-hmm. You're very good at showing how Northerners were giving Southerners all kinds of compromises, essentially, for the sake of the peace, but mm-hmm. and also how there were people in the South who were very much against what was going on. So mm-hmm. it's not an absolute distinction, but there's mm-hmm. definitely this north-south thing going on, which of course is still with us mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. in our political life. And you also talk a lot, well, not a lot, but a little at the end about this notion of the Great Migration, which is another thing I'm pretty certain most Americans do not know about. I know the Black communities know all about it, but I do not think it's widely known. Can you say something about what these were?
Right. So at the end, I talked briefly about the movement of African Americans from the South to northern cities like Chicago, especially in the sort of decades between the turn of the century and World War II. But really, this migration was, in some ways, you could think of it as an exodus or as a flight from a region of the country that was still, you know, extremely dangerous and unjust for formerly enslaved people and their families. And so, the Great Migration can be seen partly as a response to the resilience of white supremacy in the South. You know, new systems arose after slavery that served as, in some ways, functional replacements for slavery. Prisons were used to entrap freed people and to put them to labor in penitentiaries or on chain gangs and convict leasing. You know,
And a kind of white terrorism.
White terrorism. You know, lynching and violence that ultimately led to the disfranchisement of African Americans who had received the vote during Reconstruction by 1900. So, you know, people started to look elsewhere, you know, look for where freedom might be found, and they didn't find it in the North either, as you know, as I was referring to earlier. You know, it proved, places like Chicago proved to be not quite the promised land that they hoped that it would be. But that is a story that transformed those northern cities, and culturally, socially, you know, politically, the impacts of that Great Migration are still being felt today.
Can we, you know, when we use a word like lynching, it just kind of goes past us. We don't really realize what that was. And my African American colleagues and students have taught us a lot about lynching. And I mean, I've seen photos. I've seen postcards that were sent around. I've seen black men hanging in trees in front of churches. Can you give the listeners a feel for what a lynching really was and why it was such a powerful form of essentially white terrorism?
Well, I mean, as you note, these were public executions that were meant to be public spectacles, and you know, were treated as such by white Southerners at the time, who came in crowds to participate and observe these, to commercialize them, and I think they were intended to be more than a single act of violence. They were meant to terrorize whole communities. And you know, there's good scholarship being done now by historians to trace out what was the impact of that kind of trauma on the survivors, you know, on family members of people who were being targeted in these ways. There's a historian, Kadada Williams, working on has written a book about racial violence up through World War One, but also was working on a second book precisely on that. You know, testimonies of people who lived through these experiences in their communities, and the long-lasting impacts of that kind of violence. You know, I think we're still trying to come to grips with what that means. And you know, the memorial that's now, you know, been erected in Alabama through the Equal Justice Initiative, I think is shining a light on that. You know, they are systematically trying to keep track of places in the South where these lynchings occurs. I don't know if you've heard about this.
I have not,
memorial,
actually.
or so. It's a really interesting model for a memorial or a museum. What they've done is they've gone to all the places where a lynching occurred. You know, small hamlets in the South, places like Houston, and they collect soil from those towns or from those places and bring a container of that soil back to the memorial. So if you go, you can see a room with, a wall just covered with these jars of soil, and they issue a challenge to the communities that were impacted and represented on that wall to come and take that soil and bring it back to their community and commit to building a memorial or some marker of what happened there and some way of remembering that violence. So it's a very interesting, way of kind of forcing communities today to reckon with that and decide, what are we going to do once it's been discovered that this horrific act of violence happened here?
It's so hard to remember things you don't want to remember.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of Germany, for example, and the Holocaust, and how, the Germans have erected really powerful memorials and just essentially dealing with these horrific acts of mass violence. And we tend to want to remember the happy stuff, or to just simply change the memories, right? So this is one role where I think a historian can come in and say, no, essentially.
Well, I think one thing the book shows is the process of kind of rewriting these stories happened almost immediately
Instantly,
at the time.
Yeah. You show that with the media reports on Henrietta.
Exactly. Zebulon Ward, who I mentioned, was the man who she held to account. Only a few years after the lawsuit, he was in the papers telling a very different story about what had happened.
He was
his
lying,
story, he was
essentially.
basically lying, and the story got a lot more play. And I think that's, one of the reasons why I do what I do, or historians do what they do, is try to go back to the sources and see if we can separate myth from fact, and can we, that makes it sound maybe a little too much about sort of figuring out what are the certainties. There's still interpretation involved, and we still have to sometimes read against the grain to find things in sources that those sources weren't created to disclose to
Absolutely.
us. But that's part of the hard work of doing historical research, is not just finding documents or sources, but then actually spending time reading them and interpreting them to especially to try to get to the voices of people who have been silenced by later stories and myths and the forgetting that you talked about, people like Henrietta Wood,
But not just the forgetting, the repressing. I mean, the active dissimulation.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, what makes this one of the many things that makes this such a powerful book is the only piece of writing we really have from Henrietta is an X, right?
Right. She was not able to read or write, so she, in the lawsuit that she filed, she was forced to make her legal mark on affidavits, which just meant drawing an X. But I think at the same time,
she spoke,
and she was very savvy about her legal rights and her legal strategy. She, to me, really the story of the book is driven by her determination to tell her story at each step of the way. After she was abducted, within hours of that abduction, she was already telling the story of what had happened to her to people she encountered. She told it to some reporters in the 1870s who published lengthy interviews with her, her story as told in her own words to them. And she told it to her lawyers who helped her to file this case. So the book would not have been possible without her determination to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a kind of oral component that gets recorded by these journalists, essentially.
Right. Which of course, is, and again, going back to why the difficulty of recovery, we know as historians that those sources have problems too. They're not perfect sources. They're the story told to, in both cases, most likely white men who were recording what she said, but maybe not recording everything she said, or sometimes emphasizing some things more than others. So it's not a perfect or unmediated way of getting to her story, but it also is, I think, an extraordinarily rare opportunity to hear from a formerly enslaved woman about her experience, and telling her story as she would have wanted it to be told, or what were the salient points for her to some degree. So
Can you tell our listeners a bit about Lafcadio?
sure,
I
yeah.
mean, clearly one of the most colorful characters in the book, and probably the main journalist who ends up communicating her story to a
Right,
broader public.
right, yeah. So I mentioned there were two newspaper interviews she gave in the 1870s, and the first one that I read was published in 1879 by a pseudonymous reporter in a small town Ohio newspaper. And that interview was actually spread over 4 issues of this newspaper, so it was kind of a serial. But the first installment of it is in an issue of the newspaper that doesn't exist anymore. This gets back to the gaps in the record and things historians can't find. So when I first read that interview in 2014, I wasn't sure I could write an entire book about the story because I didn't know about her life prior to her abduction, and I couldn't tell kind of the whole arc of her story. But a year later, it turns out that there was another interview that she gave with Lafcadio Hearn, and he was a reporter in Cincinnati, Ohio, who in 1876 met Wood and recorded her story. So this was in some ways kind of one of those contingencies or fortuitous encounters, because Hearn went on to become sort of a literary celebrity in the 19th century in his own right. He moved to New Orleans and became very famous there as a writer about Creole culture and foodways in New Orleans. Later, he moved to Japan, and there, writing under a different name, he became sort of a household name in Japan. He collected folk tales, Japanese folk tales, and published them. And so it's been interesting as I've been traveling the country and talking about the book. When I mention his name, if there's anyone in the audience from Japan or familiar with Japan, they immediately recognize that name, because it's sort of like if you wanted to make the comparison to sort of a Mark Twain, in the United States, who's somebody who published these folk tales and interesting kind of ghost stories. And actually, there's some books that just came out this year, sort of reissuing some of his Japanese tales. But a lot of people aren't aware that he started his career as a reporter in Cincinnati after the Civil War. And you can see some of the elements of his later interests even in that period, because he was the kind of reporter who got off the beaten path, and he was interested in ordinary people, and he was interested in the stories they told. And he was, in some ways, he was kind of similar to Edgar Allan Poe or someone like that, sort of attracted to the morbid, the kind of the darker sides of Cincinnati. And so he was a little bit of a muckraker, somebody who was exposing the darker sides of Cincinnati at the time. It was already a place of deep inequality between the respectable classes and especially poor African Americans who lived in impoverished neighborhoods along the river. And that's where he met Henrietta Wood. He was known to go into those neighborhoods and to record the stories of formerly enslaved people or dock workers, and paid a lot of attention to their social life. And so he's in some ways an imperfect but still important ethnographer of that community at that period of time. And it's just kind of one of these chances of history that he met Henrietta Wood. Although I think she sees the opportunity, as we said earlier.
Sure.
It's also about
Right.
her
Right.
willingness to share that story and tell it. And she actually met him at a moment in her lawsuit when it was sort of at a pivotal turning point, and it was sort of fading from from the headlines, as it were, and telling that story to him helped to put it back in the public eye.
As we talked earlier, as a historian of religions, I always have my eye out for, the religious elements. And one of the things that caught my eye in this book, and it's not a major theme in the book, and so maybe you haven't thought about it or maybe pursued it, but there is this theme of the heterodox or the marginal. Lafcadio's writing ghosts or interesting ghost stories, folklore, seances, this kind of other side of American religious life. And the one religious community actually that sticks out in the book as essentially getting it right morally is the Quakers, who were always a tiny community and often persecuted, both in England and in the States. And you don't get into the religious practices or identities of a lot of your main characters, but I'm presuming they're fairly traditional, very denominational Christianity kind of stuff. And so you do have this theme of, denominational Christianity being very supportive of slavery, and these sort of radical, heterodox religious groups trying to stand up and push back. And so I don't know if I'm projecting that or if that's something in the story. But
that's a great question. I mean, I certainly my first book actually that I wrote before this one was about the Abolitionist Movement, and so in that book I talked a lot more about the sort of ways that religion played a role in these radical political movements, and in some ways writing this book I had to sort of hold back a little bit because, when I got to the parts about abolitionism, it would have been really easy for the abolitionist historian in me to let that sort of take over the narrative. And I was really trying hard in the book to keep the narrative moving, and try to make it the kind of book that academic historians could read, but also general readers could pick up and find their way through. So it's kind of, when religion comes up, it's a little bit of a pops up here and there, which is,
I saw
probably not good for a religion scholar.
No, it's fine.
And often I actually, thinking, if I were to think critically about the book, it's one thing maybe that could have received more attention. I think it's something that American historians, our colleagues who are historians of U.S. religion are constantly calling on us to weave that more into the story instead of just being a sort of jack in the box that pops up, here and there.
Well, again, I actually think this is one of the things that people don't know or they've forgotten, that religion was one of the main props of slavery.
It's true. And at the same time, it also provided for enslaved people,
it's a very ambiguous,
a resource. In fact, Henrietta Wood, another place it pops up for me is when she's kidnapped, and I mentioned this 1879 interview that she gave that I was missing the first installment of, and so the second installment picks up with the kidnapping having already occurred, and she's already in Kentucky, locked in this fourth-story room. And the very first line of that interview is, that night I lay awake all night and prayed that the good Lord would deliver me out of my trouble. And to me, that was a very evocative starting point. And it shows that, and there's other evidence of this elsewhere in her interviews, it shows that for her, there was some spiritual resources that she relied on in these darkest moments. It was also interesting to me, you said religion was a prop of slavery, but I think we could equally point to capitalism and greed and kind of these just base human motives.
It's always multiple.
Zebulon Ward, I kind of was curious what was his denominational affiliation, as it were. And as far as I could tell, he was not the church-going type, which I wouldn't surprise you after you read the book. In fact, one of the characters in the book, I can't remember if we've talked about yet, that Ward was also, in addition to all the things that he did in Wood's story, he managed prisons, and he was a keeper of southern penitentiaries. and an architect of those convict leasing systems that we talked about earlier, emerging after the Civil War, to reduce enslaved people or subjugate them again to a kind of bondage. One of the prisoners in the penitentiaries that he ran said that money was his religion, which I think is probably a fitting summary.
Let's go there if we can. I mean, one of the many things I learned from the book was that, once the Civil War began and the southern states began to realize that, essentially their time was up, for at least legal slavery, Texas became a kind of refuge for slave owners. They literally transported their slaves and came to Texas to continue the practice of slavery. And I also know, just because I know you've done work for, there's a mass burial, as we know, out in Sugar Land that was probably almost certainly a product of this convict leasing that you're really talking about in the book. So I was very much struck by how the historiography or the scholarship on the history really feeds directly into your work with the Sugar Land community and the Houston community around these literal bodies in the ground and how to struggle with that, how to recognize that and to address it.
Well, it's another example of the forgetting or the gaps in collective memory of this period. So these graves that were found in Sugar Land were unearthed during the construction of a school, and there are the remains of 95 people. And so the analysis and the dating of those remains shows that they were African American victims of convict leasing. And
can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, convict leasing. See, and that's what I was going to say is a lot of people don't know, in fact, when I've talked to people about it, they're sort of surprised to hear that this happened.
I'll just voice the assumption I think people are making is if they're in prison, they have no rights. We can do whatever we want to them. We can work them to death. We can do anything. I mean, I think that's kind of the cover for for this convict leasing.
Well, I think people need to understand that the law is not just a settled reality, that it's also it can be a tool, it can be an instrument of power, and certainly when it was controlled at the end of the 19th century by former Confederates who, were intent on making sure that emancipated people did not gain a foothold in the South, they were able to wield the law as a weapon. And actually what they did was, came up with criminal statutes that were designed to be dragnets for formerly enslaved people. An example might be they would make a charge of petty larceny, for crimes, stealing property worth $5 or less would get you, 10, 20 years in the penitentiary. And
so like stealing a shirt, you're in jail for 10 years.
You're in jail, or even things like, hunting a wild hog that wasn't actually contained on someone's land, but if you killed that in order to feed your family, then if there was a sheriff around who wanted to put you in jail, they could find an excuse to do that.
And let's be clear, what we're calling larceny.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What we're calling stealing
here yes.
was really black people who didn't get paid for years and years of work, and so they would take a shirt or take something small and land in jail.
That's a good way of thinking about it. It's kind of the same sense of justice that Wood had to pursue restitution, in the courts. The people who didn't have that opportunity pursued justice in other ways. But what it ultimately meant too, is not just that they were put to work in the prison, but under the convict leasing system, the state would try to cut costs on their end by leasing the prisoners out to private contractors. And so often these private contractors were former slaveholders themselves who were still running cotton or sugar plantations, or starting new industrial enterprises in coal mines or building railroads. And they would go to the state and enter these contracts to receive X number of prisoners to come work on their plantation. And so many, African American men and women who had only recently been freed found themselves on cotton plantations or sugar plantations, under overseers who, had been slaveholders and now had very little accountability to the state.
It was just slavery in another name.
If one of the prisoners died, then the contractor could just go back to the state and say, under my contract, I'm owed another prisoner, so send another, to this camp. And so that's what people, I think, need to see about convict leasing, is that it was actually, it was a case of unaccountable power that was actually licensed by the state in the interest of saving money on the state's
totally
end,
quote unquote legal.
Yeah.
But a form of slavery nonetheless.
And a means, along with the other kinds of racial terrorism we talked about, of maintaining white supremacy, of and we talked about these laws, but sometimes ruses could be created to just grab people, put them to work in these labor camps. And so Ward, the man that Wood sues in the book, was an early architect of these kinds of systems. He ran prisons in Kentucky and Tennessee and Arkansas, never in Texas, although Texas also had one of the largest convict leasing systems that was very profitable for other men who were much like Ward. Money was their religion. And Ward, though, played a role, in that history. So one of the things I hope the book does is gets people to think about the continuities between those two histories. That there's the story of Wood holding him to account for slavery, but then there's also the story of what came after slavery, and it actually made him a fabulously wealthy man. By the time he died, he would have been a multimillionaire in today's terms, just from the systems of convict labor that he had presided over.
One of the things that Earl Lewis lectured about this week was what he calls the first slavery and the second slavery, and then the third slavery. And maybe again, just for the sake of the conversation, can you define those three terms?
Well, I think he meant by the third slavery sort of contemporary human trafficking, and he pointed out that this is a large problem, in our contemporary world. Traffickers who prey on vulnerable people who are desperate to move to another country in search of another job, and they're promised, wages that will make a huge difference for them. Then they get there, and the trafficker says they're owed, they owe them more than they could possibly pay, working at that wage for multiple years, and then they find themselves locked in a kind of a debt bondage that essentially puts them at the disposal.
So the third slavery is all around us,
yeah.
And we're talking about tens of millions of people in some kind of forced bondage. These are the people that show up dead in the back of semis, for example.
Right.
But they're also all around us. The second slavery then is what?
I actually don't remember him.
Well, so the first slavery would end with the amendment, right? And with the Emancipation Proclamation.
So did he use that term to talk about like the convict leasing and those kinds
Jim
of
Crow laws?
Jim Crow laws, okay.
And so I was just, can you, because this is something you do in the book, is you show how slavery really didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation and the amendment. It really continued in other ways and in other names. And these often are called Jim Crow laws. Again, I think that's just something we need to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the abolitionists I wrote about in my first book, a guy named Wendell Phillips, had a quote where he said after the Civil War that slavery was dead, but the slaveholder remains. And I think that's that captures the story of this book too. People like Zebulon Ward, who had been enslavers, prior to emancipation, were still around after emancipation and were devising new means of exploiting people. So the cast of characters, the systems changed, and there were. I think we should pause and say there were significant differences between chattel slavery and convict leasing.
Well,
but
what's
the cast of characters were the same.
So what's chattel slavery and what's a Jim Crow law?
Yeah. So chattel slavery. I mean, I think what's critical there is the way that people were commodified and bought and sold. We talked about the capital value of enslaved people on the eve of the Civil War. And so in the case of the United States, that chattel slavery was also racial slavery, racialized slavery.
It was linked to skin color.
It was linked to race, and it it turned people into, in legal terms, property. They were both people and property in the eyes of the law. And so we find all kinds of strange laws on the books about, inheritance. How do you decide, the inheritance of people?
The debate in religious terms was whether to baptize, whether they were allowed to be baptized. Because if you baptize a slave,
right,
this person is a child of God, to use the theological language. Well, if this person is a child of God, why are we treating him like a cow?
There's kind of a paradox running throughout that, there is a sort of a schizophrenia in Southern law at the time of sometimes treating enslaved people as people, for the purposes, for example, of punishing them for crimes they might commit, and then in other cases viewing them as chattel property. So I think one thing that's different about the convict leasing systems is, there people were profiting solely off the labor of the prisoners, what they were making, what they were cultivating, but the private contractors couldn't buy or sell the prisoners, even though there were exchanges of a kind, to make that happen. There is a significant difference there, and a difference too in the involvement of the state in overseeing this and sort of granting the power over these prisoners to these private citizens, whereas under slavery, a private citizen who owned people was seen in the eyes of the law as kind of the master of his property, the master of his domain. I mean, that's one legacy to me of slavery that we can see continuing on today, which is the high value that our legal system places on property rights and property holders, and puts all kind of obstacles in the way of states that might try to raise revenue, raise taxes, get at the property. A lot of what's baked into our state statutes and the way our state governments are constructed was built in that time in the 19th century to kind of give property holders, in that case slaveholders, all kinds of power over
other people.
Yeah.
So what's a Jim Crow law?
So that's a term that was used to describe basically segregation laws that emerged around the turn of the 20th century that forbade racial mixing in certain spaces, that disfranchised African Americans either outright through constitutional amendments or through other indirect means like poll taxes or white primaries. These were laws that were designed to ensure that people of African descent remained second-class citizens in the United States.
Okay. Yeah. So let's move out to sort of expand the conversation in the sense of I'll expand it in terms of a personal question. Is why are you doing this? And not just why are you doing it, but how do you keep your optimism, or how do you keep your spirit up? I mean, this is a devastating story in many ways. The 400-year history of racism is horrific on every level.
Well, what's more horrifying, though, to reckon with it or not to, and to leave it, as you said, in these kind of shrouded in myth, that's, to me,
okay,
a worse case.
That's a great answer.
Than to actually do the work of reckoning with it.
So for you, this is what I'm trying to get at, though. So for you, scholarship, historical consciousness, this reckoning with the past, has a kind of, again, I'm a historian of religions. It has a kind of redemptive feature to it, or not. I mean, it's really a question.
Yeah.
Is it a reckoning with the past so that we can achieve some sense of social justice? Is it, why? I guess I'm trying to be the naive reader here. Why reckon with the past? Why not let the past go? And of course, I don't believe that, but I think that's a question that is often articulated.
Yeah. Well, I think it frames the question as though we had a choice, when in fact, history is all around us, and whether we realize it or not, we're telling ourselves stories about the past that are influencing how we see our world and what we see as possible futures, and so we're constantly, not just in the classroom or through books, but through movies, through monuments, that we might see on our public landscape. We're surrounded by history.
Elections, political maps.
Exactly.
I mean, you can't read this book and not think about red and blue states. I mean, it's just so obvious.
So it's not as though we have just a sort of abstract choice of whether or not to engage with the past. It's more a question of how we do that, and what's a good way to do it, or what's better ways of doing it, and worse ways of doing it. So
let me ask you this then. Let me ask you another kind of question about the humanities, and I'll begin with something I often say about books. So for me, a book like this, but a lot of works of scholarship, it's sort of an apocalypse frozen into two covers. In other words, it'll end your naivete, but it'll also begin a whole new world. But it has to be activated by a reader. It's silent. It's just sitting here. And the way I joke about this in terms of my own experience of publishing books is, every time I publish a book, I honestly feel like the world has fundamentally changed, and that there should be fireworks in the sky and a national holiday or something. And instead, of course, absolutely nothing happens. I say it's like throwing a Kleenex off the Grand Canyon and waiting for an echo. Just some bird takes it and shits on it or builds a nest or something, and that's the end of it. So there's this, as intellectuals, I think we truly believe that what we do matters. And of course, I believe that. I sincerely believe that. And yet, what we do is encoded in books that are easily ignored or easily set aside. And so the question is, how do we, as scholars in the humanities, how do we communicate to broader and broader publics why this scholarship is important, why, if it's not read, it should be talked about, to broader and broader publics. Right. I think we're very good at talking to each other. We know the lingo. We know how to do that. We're good at talking to our students in a classroom. But when it comes to these broader conversations, we retreat. And I understand why we retreat. I really do. But can you reflect on that?
Well, I think it's a good question, and certainly as I was writing this book, was thinking precisely about how to reach a more general reader or interest a more general reader, because a lot of the books we write are solidly researched take years of our lives to write, and they're aimed partly at our colleagues, who help us to build knowledge around that topic, which I think is true of our colleagues in the sciences or any field, that there is a certain level of scholarship that is intended to be read by other scholars. Right. That's just the way that basic knowledge is produced and science advances. And so there's nothing wrong with that, and we need that. And this book relies on a lot of scholarship that was written in that way, for other scholars to push the ball forward and develop our knowledge. So that needs to continue. But there is a need too for humanities to kind of reach out to the broader public, since history and humanities is everywhere. To me, with this book, the way into that was, this was a story. This was a very compelling, to me, and I hope to others, narrative. It has a lot of drama. It has a lot of turning points, and I think that's we're sort of hardwired to story as human beings. It's the way we think about ourselves. We narrate our lives to ourselves, and there's a lot of great scholarship before this book, about slavery and convict leasing and reparations struggles. But I think one thing that journalists like in the 1619 Project or other examples we could point to understand is the importance of delivering that through a story, that draws people in and makes people on some basic level just want to know what happens next, right. and how I think the humanities is really good too at dealing with just the human condition and the human conundrums we all face. I'm in this moment, I have decisions to make, I have to make sense of my world. We all can relate to that, and so a story can put you hopefully in sort of the shoes of somebody who's facing the same kinds of dilemmas and trying to deal with it in the context of their time and in their world. So for me, storytelling is one way. It's not the only way. I think things like the lynching memorial that we talked about earlier is another powerful way. But storytelling is one way of getting outside the walls of the academy and drawing people in.
One of the things I want to talk about through the podcast is, and this will sound nerdy, but you'll get it instantly, is this balancing of sameness and difference. As you know, in the humanities, we talk about difference primarily. We don't talk about sameness, and some of us, I think, would even deny sameness. And yet, the reason this is such a powerful story is we recognize in Henrietta ourselves. She's a human being like us, like the reader. So, but her experience is nothing like mine or yours, or right. I hope almost any of ours. So the story is driven by almost total difference, and yet we only can understand it because of this shared sameness that underlies it all. And I think that's something we don't do so well, actually. But you do beautifully in the book.
Oh, thank you. That is a challenge. I think because we don't want to collapse the distance between that time and ours, and assume, we always work with our students, to try to challenge them to think about actors in the past as not just
versions of
themselves, but but at the same time there is some relation there. I think that's
otherwise how could we do history?
One of the differences between the humanities and sciences is you can't ask a rock how it feels, but you can talk to people, and you and even if they're long dead, you can still encounter them and inquire of them by reading their words. So there is a dialogic kind of dimension to everything we do that's made possible because we're studying human beings.
Do you one of the things I struggle with is, there's a big push in the academy to make more and more what we do accessible to broader publics. And I suppose this podcast is part of that. But a lot of the, and I'll say truths, but a lot of the conclusions or truths in the humanities, particularly in the study of religion, actually are not communicable in a way that that will be embraced by the public. In other words, they're difficult truths.
Sure.
They're difficult things to hear.
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel like our colleagues in the natural sciences, they're doing the easy stuff. You know, when they create a new piece of technology or they come up with a new proof of something, it's easy to understand why it's a good thing to know. But when we come up with our truths, they're often very difficult things for people to accept, you know, on an emotional or familial or personal level even. And this is a good example of that. This is a story that's powerful, but that many people will not want to hear. So how do you think about that as a? I
mean, I'm sure there's parallel cases. You know, climate scientists, for example,
absolutely,
you know, coming up with some
evolutionary biologists.
So I guess I don't see it as a stark, maybe quite as stark as you drew it. Because I think, you know, if I picked up a climate science journal myself, I wouldn't understand personally half of what I was reading there, but I would trust that my colleagues do, and I think similarly, you know, a lot of times the media takes a religion journal or something that has a lot of jargon and says no one can understand this. Well, that's just the way that, you know, scholarship.
So let me broaden the question, because well taken. I accept your nuancing of my exaggerated framing. But what do we do then with the public rejection of expertise?
That's a big question, isn't it? Yeah. Now I feel like I'm in the hot seat.
No, I don't mean to put you, because I'm in the hot seat too. I think we're all in the hot seat on this one, and. To me, it's a real burning question, and I don't have an answer.
I think it's something that certainly we're at a time where we do seem to have to defend first principles, you know, and go back to the idea of evidence and the painstaking work of fact checking and you know, and I think that's actually a place where we can find a lot of common cause with our colleagues on the other side of campus. You know, we're all kind of in this same boat, as it were, of defending the value of this kind of knowledge production. And I think it is a you know, you can on some days it feels like a crisis, on some days it just feels like the job. You know, that's just the challenge that we face. But I agree with you that that's, you know, on my mind these days.
Well, listen, that's all. Those were my responses to the book, which of course
it's a great
I loved.
Conversation. Enjoyed talking.
I'm so happy you could join us, and this is a good first beginning. And I hope the conversation, you know, as we move to other partners and colleagues and projects, it sort of deepens. And I mean, this is already deep, but
you've got at least one future listener.
Okay. There we go. We'll start with one. Okay. Well, thank you, Caleb.
Thank you.
It's been a joy.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right.